Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Open Symposium for 2024. Good morning and welcome to the Family Violence and Sexual Violence Pre-Symposium seminar. It's a pleasure to have you all with us to begin this year's Open Symposium with a focus on addressing family violence and sexual violence. Before we begin, we will play a beautiful and moving Welcome to Country from Kelly Hunter.
Uminjika kabi malimangu naranik Kelly. Waranjeri boyrorong ik. Waranjeri kana malambalakut boyrorong ik. Nungujan womanyat bikdui ik. Welcome, greetings, how are you all? My name is Kelly and my people are the Wurundjeri of the Woiwurrung. My inner mob are the Gunnerwillumballuk. I thank you all for being here on country. I'd like to acknowledge my Gugum and my Mumun Mamun, my grandmother and my father, who have instilled in me my pride in who I am today, in my Aboriginality and my culture. I pay my respects to Luwik, Baluk, Nugalik, my ancestors, elders, past, present, and future. The very first footprints on this continent were those belonging to First Nations people. Our nation's story began at the dawn of time. Our people were the first to endure climate change, catastrophic droughts, and rising sea levels. Our ancestors were first to explore, navigate, and farm. They were the first astronomers, artists, scientists. We invite all Australians to embrace the true history of this country, a history that dates back thousands of generations. We ask you to see, to hear, and to learn the First Nations' 65,000 plus year history. We want all Australians to celebrate that we have the oldest continuing cultures on the planet and to recognise that our sovereignty was never ceded. As I walk on country, it will continue to resonate with me and my future generation, that it always was and always will be a spiritual and cultural connection to country for many First Nations people.
Thank you, Sarah, for playing that beautiful message for us. I'd like to also add our acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all virtually gathering today. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Great Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I always find that recording really both settling and also when I think about some of the presentations you're going to hear over the next 2 or 3 days, and we think about how precious these lands are, particularly in relation to climate change. I think both that acknowledgement, what's happening for First Nations people, and some of what you'll hear over the next 3 days will really, really make you think. Okay, so just a couple of housekeeping notes Please note that we are recording today's sessions. I'd like to encourage you to keep your camera on during these presentations where you can. Please mute yourself throughout the session to avoid background noise or interruptions for those who are presenting. Our presenters love questions and engagement, so please turn your chat box on and ask lots of questions. The team will be curating them throughout the session to provide them to the presenters. There is an option to turn on live captions for this event at the bottom of your screen, and we're all very used to tech problems with online events, but if you do have trouble, first try leaving and rejoining the session, which often fixes the problem, or call Matt Edwards, whose details are on screen now, and hopefully he'll be able to help you if you're struggling. Okay, so in terms of the context for the day, today provides us with a forum for promoting the collaborative work of the Centre and our fellow peaks, No to Violence, Safe and Equal and Sexual Assault Services Victoria, or as we know them, SASVIC. In 2023, Family Safety Victoria funded the 4 peaks to work together to create opportunities for building and sharing evidence of what works to share across our 4 workforces. Each peak has brought its own particular expertise and knowledge to this project, and the collaboration has been highly successful in strengthening the capability of our respective workforces. Only at the beginning of that, so it's an exciting time for us. One of the products of this cross-peak partnership has been the creation of a family violence and sexual violence knowledge hub, which the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, Vicky Ward MP, will officially launch this morning. So it's great to have you all here for that. This is a very exciting initiative and is the culmination of months of hard work with our peak colleagues. As every person in this session today knows, family violence and sexual violence remain pervasive in our community with profound and long-lasting impacts on children, young people, adults and families. For children in particular, exposure to domestic or sexual violence, even indirectly, can have devastating emotional, psychological and developmental consequences. Their experience is distinct and their recovery requires tailored interventions which recognise the extent of their trauma. I want to acknowledge the complexities faced by specialist workforces who provide critical support for individuals and families who are experiencing or have experienced family violence or sexual violence. Working at the intersections of family violence, sexual violence and child protection requires deep expertise, sensitivity and resilience. The nuanced and multifaceted nature of this work demands not only a broad understanding of trauma, but also highly specialised skill sets to address the varying needs of adult and child victims alike. This is really tough stuff. In today's session, we will hear from experts who bring years of experience and research to these complex issues. We will hear presentations that will deepen our understanding of culturally responsive family violence practices, youth-focused interventions, and the important work towards better outcomes for those affected by violence. The Centre is proud to work alongside our fellow peaks, No to Violence, Safe and Equal, and SASVIC in bringing compelling content and conversations to you today. So fantastic to be with you. I want to also acknowledge if this is difficult subject matter for any and all of you here today, please reach out for help because these are really, really difficult issues we're talking about. Okay, so I'm hoping our presenter is here now for the next session. Great. Now on to today's session. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kate Fitz-Gibbon, who will be known to many of you, a distinguished scholar, a leading expert on violence against women. Kate brings an impressive range of experience to the field with a global reputation for her work on domestic and family violence, femicide and perpetrator interventions. She's a professor of practice at the Faculty of Business and Economics at Monash University, and also the principal consultant at Sequire Consulting, which she founded in 2024. Kate's academic journey includes a PhD in criminology and a master's in human rights law. Kate's expertise has informed policy and practice reforms both here in Australia and internationally, and her research has been cited by the High Court of Australia. So welcome, Kate.
Many thanks, Deb. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, so I will just make sure that I can do so. Here we go. Good morning, everybody. It is an absolute privilege to be here. It is an absolute privilege to be here today and be joining you for the launch of what is such an important open resource. So I am absolutely thrilled to have been invited to speak to you today. I am, unsurprisingly, given Deb's introduction, speaking to you today on the topic of From Rhetoric to Action, Achieving the National Plan's Ambition of Recognising Children as Victim Survivors in Their Own Right. I'm going to take a few minutes this morning to speak to you on the national agenda, locating where victim survivors sit in terms of their recognition as victim survivors in their own right, some research that I have conducted alongside colleagues at Monash University, looking specifically at victim survivors' experiences as young people of navigating the family violence system, and then really looking forward to opening up to wider questions. I do want to begin this morning by reiterating my colleagues' wonderful acknowledgements. I joined this morning from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and paying my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also really like to extend that to all First Nations people joining today, and just want to acknowledge the tremendous learning and experience that exists within First Nations communities in the space of family violence response and prevention, and how much we have to learn in that space. So I wanted to start today by locating why are we speaking on children and young people. And I know that this will be a little bit of a given for many people who are joining us today, and that's not a bad thing, but it's important for us to remember the importance of children and young people in their own right. And we are fortunate in the last 12 months to have had the incredible landmark Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study, which gives us a much better quantitative, evidence-based understanding of the experiences of children and young people from family violence, domestic and sexual violence. And the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study found that experiences of child maltreatment, including acts of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect, are incredibly widespread across the Australian population. And the study found that among Australians aged 16 to 65 years old, that 32% have experienced physical abuse during childhood. I could also present that as 1 in 3. That just under 1 in 3, 28.5% of Australian children and young people have experienced sexual abuse during childhood. That 31% of Australian young people have experienced emotional abuse during childhood. And that 9% of young people have experienced neglect during childhood. The Australian Child Maltreatment Study found that within these horrific numbers of prevalence, suggesting the normalisation of domestic, family and sexual abuse across the Australian community, that girls are at a greater risk for most types of maltreatment, including at a higher risk of experiencing sexual abuse and emotional abuse than boys. And that specifically 1 in 3 Australian girls experience child sexual abuse, and that they experience this at significantly higher rates than their male counterparts. And I want to pause for a moment, because what we're talking about here is a violence that is widespread, that is normalised, and that is an everyday experience of Australian children and young people. And yet, children and young people within Australia all too often encounter systems and responses that make them feel invisible, that make them feel that they are only the extension of their primary caring parent, that make them feel that their risks individually are not seen nor heard. So policy and practice reform is urgently needed. And it's where I am so incredibly thrilled to see the launch of the resource as is today that will further our understandings of children as victim survivors in their own right. Without doubt, practice reform is urgently needed in this space. We have a national plan to end violence against women and children. It is now 2 years into the delivery of that national plan, which embeds a recognition of children as victim survivors in their own right. Yet the extent to which that recognition, the rhetoric surrounding the recognition of children as victim survivors in their own right, the extent to which that has been achieved is still highly debatable. What I wanted to take a moment for the next 20 minutes or so, and then I'm really looking forward to opening up to questions with Deb, is to tell you a little bit about a study that I had the absolute privilege to undertake in the last year. And this is the I Believe You study. And the I Believe You study was conducted for Family Safety Victoria alongside my absolutely wonderful colleagues at Monash University, Dr. Jasmine McGowan and Dr. Rebecca Stewart. And in this study, we were interested to understand young people's experiences of seeking help in Victoria. When young people have experienced domestic, family, and sexual violence, where do they seek help? How do they seek help? And what are the outcomes of that help-seeking journey? And we spoke to 17 individual young people who had experienced help-seeking in the Victorian family and sexual violence system. And through this, we conducted a series of thematic interviews, but we were extremely guided by the young people in terms of walking us through their journey of seeking help in Victoria, acknowledging that all the young people who participated in this study received a $100 gift voucher, and that all interviews were audio recorded and transcribed in full. But that throughout this presentation, I will de-identify all data. So I will not speak specifically to their experiences, but you'll see a range identified. And wherever I'm quoting someone individually, we have used pseudonyms. So I want to start today by speaking about young people's perceptions of well-being and keeping safe, because I think this is at the heart of what brings us to the importance of working with children and young people. And at the outset of this research, we asked young people about what does it mean to have well-being? What does it mean to keep safe in the domestic, family and sexual violence system in Victoria? And I want to draw your attention to the quote from Dylan, because I think it acutely captures where children and young people are in Victoria present. And Dylan said, "I call it survival mode. For the most part, I've probably lived more of my life in it. The best I could do is make myself as quiet and small as possible, trying to become invisible." This is an outcome to become invisible that is completely at odds with our national plan, that seeks to offer a service, a practice response to children as victim survivors in their own right, that seeks to recognise that when children access and seek help, that they are responded to in their own right with their own risk identification, assessment, and management, that they are seen. Yet we know that for all too many Australian children, young people, they continue to navigate a domestic, family, and sexual violence system across Australia that was made for and by adults. And that in doing so, they are invited into a survival mode, a system whereby they navigate their own risks because it is not visible within the system. And so herein within this study and the young people that we had the absolute privilege to speak to, we acknowledge the invisibility of children, young people in family violence system responses to date. And you can see this here in the quotes from Mira and Alba, that predominantly in the systems that children and young people continue to navigate, they feel invisible. We heard from numerous young people that even where seeking help with a protective parent, even where interviewed individually by a service provider or a police officer, that professional then reverted straight back to the adult in their lives, that they remained invisible even in that help-seeking moment. And this is a really important point. I'd invite you to consider back to my opening statistics that 1 in 3 children have experienced a form of childhood maltreatment. Yet when those very same children navigate the help-seeking system, they feel invisible. They feel that they are only apparent to practitioners where they seek help through an adult victim survivor. And so I'll read out Alba's quote here, which says, "It's just a nasty cycle where people have the responsibility and accountability to help prevent it, but don't for simple reasons." And obviously, again, having services that actually look at helping children specifically, instead of just having to need a parent or guardian, because that alone cannot stop them from getting the help they need. And this is incredibly important because I would fathom us to consider that in October 2024, we sit on the back of 10 years of reform since the horrific killing of Luke Batty by his father. A moment in Australia that cast family violence into the national spotlight, a moment when a mother entered the conversation and told us that all Australians across the community are impacted by family violence, that family violence can happen in every corner of the community. Yet this data collected in the 8 to 9 years since the killing of Luke Batty reminds us that somewhere in that reform journey, we have still failed to meet the needs of young people, of the young people that are at the heart of the reason that we have the reform agenda in Australia and certainly in Victoria. What I'd really like to talk about in terms of addressing the needs and the service points of contact for children and young people is the importance of authentic first points of contact. In our research with children and young people, we ask them what they need when navigating the family violence system in Victoria and, of course, applicable across Australia. And a commonality across these interviews was the importance of that first conversation, that first discussion when a young person seeks help. And a number of young people described it in different ways to us. And I reflect on my conversation with Casper here, who said, just to say, I'm there for you. And to say something like, oh, I've been there before. I know what you're going through. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here for you. Just keep it sort of like a short question that they don't need to answer. But then if they feel like they can open up to you later, whenever that may be, then they can. And you'll see the quotes from Claire and Amira really resonate and show through similar experiences. What we're seeing here is young people's perceptions and needs of that first point of contact with the service system. And I would offer that this does not invite us into a detailed undertaking of the MARAM, a detailed undertaking of service provision, but a human moment. A moment at which young people are seeking authenticity, are seeking a safety in their help-seeking journey, to understand that the adult that they trust, they've sought to disclose their experience to, believes them and will be there for them and sees them. And all too often, in the interviews that we did, we heard of instances where the system has failed to provide that authenticity. So it's certainly a reminder for me, and I think for our colleagues across the domestic, family and sexual violence system, to pause, to take time and to see children and young people as victim survivors in their own right, in that moment in which they disclose and seek help. Of course, associated with that is the importance of us building, maintaining and delivering age-appropriate supports for children and young people impacted by domestic, family and sexual violence. And you'll see on the slide here quotes from Claire and Alba, who we spoke with as part of our I Believe You study, on the importance of supports that are specialised and age-appropriate for decades, but certainly for the last decade. Children, young people have been invited and encouraged to enter a help-seeking system that is designed for and by adults. This is one of the most significant challenges that we have within the National Plan's ambition and rhetoric to respond to children as victim survivors in their own right, is to build a system response that truly provides a specialist and age-specific response to children and young people. We heard across our interviews of the significantly challenging experiences that children and young people face when they encounter systems that had no sense of a child and young person's need, that was built purely with adult needs, adult risks, adult outcomes in mind. And so it's so encouraging to see the uptake, particularly in the last 2 years, since the National Plan's development and delivery, of responses that are or that seek to be age-specific. Children should not have to navigate a system for adults. When we think about the prevalence of domestic, family and sexual violence across the Australian children and young people community, we must have a service provision community that is ready for them. One of the significant challenges that we observed in our study was young people's experiences of mandatory reporting requirements. And I mention this specifically because I think that we often have this tension between policy ambitions and practice realities, whereby one may move faster than another, or whereby on the ground, one may be more challenging to achieve in practice. And certainly we heard from young people such as Claire, and you'll see the quote here, of the challenges that young people continue to face across Victoria. And I preface that this will be similar across Australia when they navigate systems responses, where people do not have clarity and specific understandings of the legislative requirements of aspects like the mandatory reporting. We heard of a number of help-seeking and practitioners that, of course, well-intentioned, but differentially applied the mandatory reporting requirements, that they did not within that legislation and the application of that legislation in practice centre the young person, that they did not disclose and bring to the fore the young person's agency and empowerment within their application of mandatory reporting requirements. And what is so important to understand here is that if 1 in 3 Australian children and young people have experienced domestic, family, or sexual violence in their short childhood, they have had all control and agency taken away from them. And what we certainly heard through our interviews with young people is the ways in which the application of mandatory reporting requirements repeated that lack of control within the lives of children and young people, that it took away understanding of system responses, that there were apparent or for the young person perceived breaches of trust, whereby the application of the mandatory reporting applications, an incredibly important piece of legislation, but its application practice made the young person feel that they were not seen and heard in their own right, that this was a negotiation in information sharing between the adults in their lives. So I want to allow time for Q&A between Deb and I, but to open up to some policy and practice implications and to absolutely affirm the importance of us building the evidence base on children and young people's experiences of domestic, family and sexual violence in Australia. And I'm so pleased to see the launch of the Knowledge Hub today. Amongst the young people that we spoke to in this study, children and young people were unanimous in agreement that current responses to young victim survivors of family violence are not meeting their needs, that we are not delivering upon the ambition embedded within documents such as the Royal Commission into Family Violence, which at the time so courageously labelled children as the silent victim survivors of what was recognised as a state emergency. And that now in 2024, we have a Prime Minister that has acknowledged the national emergency of violence against women and children, again, embedding in words a commitment to young people as victim survivors in their own right. But the interviews that we conducted are a harsh reminder that there is significant progress to be made to achieve the ambition of those words in practice. We need system enhancements across the domestic, family and sexual violence system in terms of better understanding the ways that children and young people navigate and access the system, the ways in which they seek help, and ensuring that they are child-specific and age-appropriate. We need to ensure that when children come into the wider system and into specific services, that they are child-centric and safe spaces. The number of children and young people that we spoke with that encountered systems and spaces that had been designed, developed, delivered only ever with adults in mind. In a country where we are confronting and seeking to address the horrors that 1 in 3 children experience these forms of abuse, we cannot have spaces that have been designed and developed without children in mind. And of course, within that, we need to develop age-specific and age-appropriate supports and individualised responses for children and young people. And Victoria here is so far ahead in terms of navigating a risk identification, assessment and management framework that is child-specific. We cannot, and research tells us specifically, the most recent research from ANROS on the killing of children and young people within the context of family violence reminds us that the risks that young people present with, that they bear when they navigate the service system, is specific to them and may be similar or distinct from the risk needs of the help-seeking parent that they may or may not navigate the system with. Of course, as in the system responses that we develop for adult victim survivors, we need to ensure safe and trauma-informed practices and greater consistency in the operation of mandatory reporting requirements. But the last thing that I want to speak on today, and I can see on the list some of the incredible prevention leaders that sit across the Victorian, Australian domestic, family and sexual violence sector, is the importance of building and embedding responses that disrupt our cycles of intergenerational violence and the normalisation of abuse across the Victorian and Australian community. I was extremely fortunate in 2022 to lead a study that was funded by Anne Rose. And in that study, we surveyed 5,000 children and young people. And part of what we asked these Australian children aged 16 to 20 was about the family violence that they experienced growing up, either amongst family members or directed specifically towards them in different forms of child abuse, and the relationship that they saw between that and the family violence that they may be using. And in that study of 5,000 Australian children and young people, we found that over 2,000 self-reported using family violence, and that within that, just over 90% had experienced family violence themselves. And I offer this finding to take us back to children and young people as victim survivors in their own right, particularly at a point in Victoria and Australia where we are seeing gains in the youth justice system be backpedaled significantly. We need to ensure that the first time that a child or young person experiences a help-seeking response is not punitive, that it is trauma-informed, and that it sees them as a victim survivor in their own right, and it seeks to address their needs and their risks before they go on to perpetrate and to use violence within the family home. And certainly not suggesting here that every young person that experiences violence will go on to use violence, but there is a significant overlap. And it is a critical reminder that in seeking to prevent and intervene early to address domestic, family and sexual violence, we absolutely must start with children and young people as victim survivors at the heart. I have whizzed quite quickly through a body of work that I've had the absolute privilege to be involved in recent years, but I want to offer my email there if anyone would like resources sent to them, copies of reports that I've been involved in. But I also know that Deb is on hand to engage in a Q&A, and so wanted to allow 10 or 15 minutes for that. So Deb, looking forward to having that discussion with you.
I'm so sorry. I feel Deb's actually, my name's Mandy Charman. I'm the Senior Manager of the Outcome Practice and Evidence Network, and we've spoken a few times on what an amazing session. There are so many things to probe, and you have such a wealth of information. Unfortunately, Deb has had to been called away urgently to another meeting. And so I'm here actually.
Wonderful.
So Britt and I will be working together to facilitate the session. But Britt will take the lead. Britt, wonderful guest facilitator, very aware of the fact that it's wonderful to have new people and new eyes on work like this. Britt Bailey is the project lead with No to Violence. She has been front and centre as part of our working group in pulling together the development of the Family Violence, Sexual Violence Knowledge Hub. And so has also worked, I think, with you in some of the work that other research you've done, Kate. So we thought it might be appropriate for her to take the lead on the question and answer. So I might hand over now to Britt, and I'm going to seed some of, I've already written down some questions because I always have questions, and I'll put them in the chat. Britt, so over to you.
Thanks, Mandy. Hi, Kate, long-time listener, first-time caller. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm always so impressed when I see you present on your research. And I think we have a bit of a theory over at NTV that you don't sleep because we see so much quality and quantity of research coming from you. When I'm doing my literature reviews and things, it's always Kate Fitz-Gibbon, Kate Fitz-Gibbon. We're just so impressed at the work that you do. And watching you present, I think that your passion in relation to family violence, but also particularly in centering the voices of children and young people, it's so obvious, it's so apparent that that's absolutely the center of what you're doing. We have a couple of questions. We'll keep an eye on the chat as well, because I think that, we can see that people are really engaged and really interested in this. Certainly a really important area in Victoria, because we know that centering the voices and experiences of children and young people is something that we're not doing amazingly, something that needs to be advanced, needs to be developed, and people like you who are championing this work is so essential. So my first question over to you is, what do you see as the most significant challenges faced by the sector in centering children and young people as victim survivors in their own rights, particularly in the family violence space?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brett. I mean, that was just such a generous and beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. I think our most significant challenge in achieving a systems response that truly sees children as victim survivors in their own right is that this cannot be an add-on. This cannot be a nice to have, an addition within current system responses. We need to reimagine what a system response that truly centres and responds to children and young people in their own right looks like. And it means bringing together different service providers and practitioners than we've necessarily had in the tent before. It means ensuring that our children and family services, alongside our specialist domestic, family and sexual violence services, as well as our incredible service providers that are working with people who use violence, understand, acknowledge, see, and respond to that young person in their own right in the first instance. For far too often, I know that I touched on this in the presentation, it's taken until a young person is using violence for them to receive a response that is directed, punitively so, directly at them. We need to take the step earlier and ensure that when young people are experiencing domestic, family or sexual violence in all its manifestations, that there is a service system for them to access. We need to imagine what that looks like in terms of accessibility. What does that look like in terms of the information and the resources that they need to enter into that system? Keeping in absolute front of mind that there will be two very distinct categories of children and young people that access the system. Children who access the system with a protective parent, and children and young people that access the system individually. And that we need to ensure that we have the flexibility, the maturity, the specialisation within the system to respond to both their needs.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kate, particularly that children and young people often receive more of a response when they are using adolescent violence in the home. And I think that it's really alarming to hear that we put a lot more supports around children and young people once they begin engaging in some of those harmful behaviours. And I guess, what do you see as some of the biggest impacts if we aren't centering children and young people in decision making, and we aren't engaging them in services and seeing them as as victim survivors in their own right?
I mean, the impacts are devastating across the Victorian and Australian community. We know, and we have significant bodies of work that show us and evidence that the impacts of domestic, family, and sexual violence last across a lifetime, that they are the most significant contributor to ill health in terms of mental and physical health, in terms of engagement in risky behaviours into adulthood for children and young people, in terms of education outcomes. Within our ANROS study, we specifically gathered a lot of data around the ways in which experiences of domestic, family, and sexual violence impact a young person's engagement and participation in the education and school system, because we know that this has lifelong impacts for them well beyond potentially their experiences of violence. We heard that young people often retreat from school, from education, that their participation within it is significantly hindered, and that specifically their ongoing engagement with education, employment, opportunities, their ability to dream and to thrive is significantly impacted by their experience of domestic, family, and sexual violence. And taking us back to that broader perspective within the national plan, I'd invite us to consider that the national plan sets out ambitions for the delivery of services to children as victim survivors in their own right across prevention, early intervention, response, and then critically, recovery and healing. So what we need to ensure is that as part of that, we reimagine and we absolutely most certainly fund a service system that supports children and young people to not only survive their experience of domestic, family, or sexual violence, but to recover and heal, to go on to thrive beyond that experience. And that's not something that to date has been given nearly enough attention.
Yeah. Yeah, really good points there, Kate. And I think I can really hear your human rights perspective coming in there when we're thinking about the impacts of children and young people's experiences of violence and when they can't access services as clients in their own right. Those long-term impacts, those impacts on them being able to thrive as children. And it's a human right for children and young people to be able to thrive and to be able to engage in education without interruption. You said earlier that we're expecting children and young people to navigate a system designed by adults for adults. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on how we can better include children and young people in designing services, being fully engaged in that process and doing it in a meaningful way, not in a tick-the-box consultation way, but true co-design?
Yeah, Mandy, I think this is absolutely critical. And the learnings from the I Believe You project, as well as a couple of projects I've been involved in since, really drove home to me the expertise that children, young people who have navigated the system have in terms of how we build age-appropriate, specialised and effective system responses. I've really spent a lot of time thinking back to kind of the 1980s and 90s of building a domestic and family violence system response, whereby we predominantly had in those early decades of the domestic and family violence system, men building systems that they assumed you could add women into. And that would be an effective response. For so long, we have built systems for women victim survivors based on the assumptions of what they need. And I think it's really important at this critical point that we do not repeat the same mistake for children and young people, that we do not build system responses to children and young people based on our assumptions of what they need. Let's ask them. Let's have them at the table, at the co-design table, at the development and delivery table, in terms of understanding what is it that children and young people seek, want, need at that help-seeking moment throughout their journey. What is it when we look back and we know, certainly, and most horrifically, from domestic violence death review inquiries, we know the power of learnings, of looking back, of understanding where the points of intervention are that we miss in a person's lives that could have been pivotal to preventing escalation of abuse. what are those moments for children, young people? Wherein lie those opportunities for us to intervene and offer supports? We haven't done nearly enough of that. Engagement and truly listening with children, young people in their own right as victim survivors.
Thanks, Kate. You paint a really strong picture there, and I think that we can all relate to that. And I think that we often underestimate how much children and young people do want to get involved in their own service provision and want to make decisions about their own right and their own support. We've got a couple of questions coming through the chat, so excuse me while I sort of navigate this. So with the ACMS findings, it is obvious how fundamental these experiences are to children and effectively to all of us. Would you have some thoughts on the current national interest in establishing a child rights agenda for our country? And what would be your front and centre considerations in making this effective to changing the landscape for children experiencing family or sexual violence? Big question. Sorry, take that in.
We're not starting on a small one there, are we? I mean, I think we constantly grapple with this in Australia, don't we? That we don't have a significant rights-based framework upon which we're building our domestic, family and sexual violence system. Certainly the findings of the ACMS, the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study, I mean, they show us so starkly we can't shy away from it, that this is an issue that is impacting upon the enjoyment, the achievements of rights of children, young people across Australia. I think throwing a rights-based agenda and lens over it is really important, but let's not forget what's at the heart of this. We have numerous already state, national-based agendas that purport to advance the interests of children as victim survivors in their own right. What we're seeing, I think at the moment, kind of 1 or 2 years into some of those agendas, and I'm thinking specifically here of the national plan, is a disjunct between where the rhetoric is at and where the action in practice is at. If we truly purport to see children as victim survivors in their own right, as rights holders, if I take the framing of this question specifically, then we need to ensure that the funding models for service design, delivery and practice align. We need to ensure that children and young people are recognised in their own right as clients for funding, that the practitioners that they seek help from have been given specific and specialised training to respond to their needs. They cannot be an add-on and merely an extension of the adult that they may or may not seek help with, but they must be an individual in their own right. And we have not yet seen the achievement of that in practice, which of course impedes on their enjoyment and their fulfilment of a number of rights. Their right to live a life free from violence, their right to education, their right to employment, their right to play. All of these rights are impacted when children cannot live free from domestic, family and sexual violence.
Yeah, great. And Kate, I was thinking of a few things there while you're speaking, but I'm interested in, I guess your research spans across Australia and internationally. Have you come across any policy or practice responses that are doing this well, that are centering the voices of children and young people well, and are doing that true co-design?
I mean, it's always a nice idea if we can pick up a model from overseas and see how it's done and then import it here. I think one of the challenges in this space is that certainly in our policy pronouncements, Australia is leading. So it is incredibly unique to have a commitment to children and young people as victim survivors in their own right at the national policy level. And I think that is a progress and achievement that we should be incredibly proud of. Certainly when we look across individual sectors, and I'm thinking here in particular of some of the incredible leading work that Chelsea Tobin, CEO of Safe Steps, has done in recent months as part of her Churchill Fellowship, there are pockets of best and emerging practice in terms of services, particularly in the homelessness space, that are truly designed for children, young people in their own right. They're designed with the child at the core. And so there's absolutely ad hoc learnings for us there. But one of the significant challenges that we have is that we are building, imagining a system in Victoria, across Australia, that we don't necessarily have a blueprint for internationally. And so that's hard. But I think, I've heard some phenomenal wisdom from the Victorian Commissioner for Children and Young People, Liana Buchanan, in this space. Like we can't take our foot off the pedal. Undoubtedly, since the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, some of the recommendations around children and young people have been given the lightest touch or have been left towards the tail end of the reform agenda. When we think back to those horrific findings from the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study, why would we leave children towards the end? So we need to be moving very quickly to reimagine a specific service system response for them.
Yeah, wow. What do you think it is that gets in the way? What do you think it is about the political agenda that isn't prioritising the needs of children and young people?
Well, I would say federally, it would be wonderful to see a Minister for Children, someone that has a seat at the federal table and has purely children in mind. But of course, we have numerous seats that should have children in mind, and we're so fortunate in Victoria to have a specific minister for children. I think one of the challenges has been that in a very well-meaning effort to ensure that we do not re-traumatize and that we do no harm, is that we haven't felt bold to ask children and young people what they want in the same way that we do adult victim survivors. But the I Believe You study, as well as the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study and the ANRO study that I led on adolescent family violence, reminds us that children and young people with these experiences have so much knowledge to share on how the service system could be improved. This should not be a barrier. We need to invite children, young people with all their lived expertise to the table to redesign our system. And I'm sure he won't be unfamiliar to many of the 100 people joining the call today. You look at phenomenal advocates like Connor Powell, who can so articulate and clearly tell us the ways in which the system failed in his journey as a child victim survivor of family violence. We need to listen to those. We need to confront those, and we need to design a system that meets children's needs.
That sounds like a call to action there, Kate, to be bold and imagine a future where we are truly and genuinely centering the voices and experiences of children and young people and honouring them and their autonomy. So we've got a question coming in through the chat here. So I work in mental health. What resources and current supports are available to educate staff and respond to children? One of the issues we have is the confidence of our staff not being a family violence specific service, though we can constantly have contact with children and their families and the ability to make a difference.
I mean, I think this is an incredibly common question and experience whereby, and thank you so much, Amanda, whereby practitioners have regular engagement with and opportunities to support children and young people, but lack the specific age appropriate and specific resources to inform their ability to do so. The first thing I would say is that our labelling of our study for family safety Victoria as I Believe You was not a mistake. That came from an interaction during the interviews, whereby I was interviewing a young person who had navigated so many points of the service system and seeking help at different points, and had never, ever in their journey had a professional believe them. And we had this interaction during the interviews where I offered that, because I could hear in their story that they were justifying, that they were explaining that they really felt that responsibility to justify their experience. And I said, you don't need to do that. I believe you, and the power of that. So I think we can all start with children and young people from a position of belief, and building, of course, from that, the incredible age-specific, appropriate, trauma-informed responses that we need. We know that we are on the verge of having the child and young person practice guidance under the Marin framework in Victoria that will be nationally leading. We know that our risk identification, assessment and management frameworks across Australia, including in Victoria, have all too often failed to see the specific needs of children and young people. So it's going to be monumental to have that in Victoria. And I really hope that other states and territories will align, follow, build from that, and that it is this moment of incredible growth in the sector whereby we have the tools needed for practitioners to support that age-appropriate practice.
Yeah. And it sounds like, we know that our policies and our infrastructure just are not up to scratch when it comes to this. And I think what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that we have some flexibility and that we can make really positive changes on the ground to make sure that we are centering those voices. We are hearing children and young people and recognising them as victim survivors in their own right. Any final tips on navigating the grey in that space?
I mean, I think that it's incredibly heartening to see, 120 people logged on today through this important launch of the Knowledge Hub. We absolutely need more evidence in this space, but we need to ensure that we're listening and hearing from children, young people in their own right, that we're not building systems, practices, policies, responses based on our assumptions of what they need. They will tell us very clearly. So I'm so excited to see the launch of the new Knowledge Hub, and I think it's an invitation for us to continue to build our evidence on what is desperately needed for children and young people if we are going to truly build system responses to them as victim survivors of all forms of domestic, family and sexual violence in their own right. And I say the sexual violence piece there really deliberately. We need to ensure that that doesn't fall off the agenda. And again, that we don't only build a system that responds when young people are using violence.
That's such a good point, Kate. And thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said earlier, your passion is absolutely infectious, and I've definitely caught it today, and I think that the rest of the people here today have. So thank you again so much. I'll pass back over to Mandy Sharman from the Centre.
Thanks so much, Brett.
Thank you. My mind is a bit reeling. Thank you so much, Britt. What a stellar facilitator you are. I took some tips from that. And Kate, oh my God, how to start off this session with a bang. I've written down a whole heap of things, and I imagine everyone else has as well. And I'm hoping, like myself, they'll be reaching out to you to explore more fully your research. We're really excited about the Family Violence, Sexual Violence Knowledge Hub for precisely the reason you've illustrated here, being able to speak to our cross sectors about the same body of knowledge and sharing across that range of expertise. So really wonderful. I've got in my line, I'm sure Deb will want to speak to you, and I'll ensure I set that up because she's trying to lead some work on this. I also wanted to note Chelsea Tobin is speaking from Safe Steps, is speaking tomorrow at the Open Symposium. So if anyone hasn't registered for that yet and is interested to hear her speak, there's an opportunity there. I just heard that she got a Churchill Fellow to do a wonderful international tour. So very envious there. What an amazing achievement. Thank you very much, Kate. And I'm hoping this will just be a start of a journey for you in relation to engaging with the Knowledge Hub and everyone in our room, because I can see you have such a wealth of knowledge about such a foundational issue, really, when you think about the numbers involved. Yeah, really, really very exciting.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning, and just a huge congratulations on the launch of the Knowledge Hub and what an incredible resource it will be across the sector for policy and practice. So really looking forward to learning from it, building on it.
And hopefully contributing to it, Kate.
And contributing to it.
Your research. Thank you very much. We might move on to our next session. I'm lucky